Originally they were all smooth, but these, the ones on the left, these were defaced by the early Christians who were being persecuted by the Romans during the early Christian period, and they thought that these gods were the reason for the persecution. So they came around to the temples, using the temples as places of hiding refuge, and they started defacing these figures that are responsible for the persecution that they were living through. It was the main battle in the north, around the area of the pyramids, between Napoleon's army and the Mamluks, who were the rulers of Egypt at that time. Some of these Mamluks managed to escape further to the south with divisions of the army, so the French army came down to pursue these Mamluks.
La légende du dictionnaire qu'on a évoqué hier matin, vous avez encore de autres représentations d'Isis à qui
die werden wir in keiner anderen Anlage sehen. Die nächste wunderbare Darstellung ist diese hier. Und zwar, wo die Isis wieder als Mutter dargestellt wird. Mutter, die ihr Kind die Brust gibt. Wie ganz oben auch. Das ist ja genau das Gleiche. Es ist eine wunderschöne Darstellung. Und zwar, Sie müssen sich ja vorstellen, jetzt sind Sie Isis. Und Sie kommen in eine Anlage, das ist ja
and festivals would take place. The scenes all around are mainly of the goddess Isis. She is the mistress of the temple and of course members of her family. The most important scenes, the most fascinating one, is this one right here. As we said, Isis is the divine mother of all the kings of Egypt. So the young prince here is shown, and you can see the hairlock, which is a symbol of youth in ancient Egypt, and he's wearing the double crown of Egypt. So he's the king of Egypt as a prince, is being breastfed by the goddess to say that he's actually the son of the goddess Isis, which then gives him every right to rule the country as a divine ruler. Other scenes also showing right up there is a much smaller child being breastfed by Isis again, and carried and introduced to the different gods and goddesses of Egypt all around. Another major scene is this one on this side, which shows Isis right there with her stretched wings protecting a figure of her husband Osiris, where the king is presenting them with offerings. In this case it's a form of an incense burner in the shape of a boat. And this really is to recall her role in a mythology, or in a story of the Egyptian mythology, which we'll talk about later on, where she resurrected Osiris. He was killed and then she brought him back to life, and it shows her protection of her husband, stretched all around. The rest of the scenes are basically of the king of Egypt, in different attire, different costumes, different crowns, presenting offerings again to the local gods and local deities of the temple, as well as other major gods and goddesses of Egypt as well. If you notice up here on the ceiling was completely roofed. Of course, the whole place was all roofed. The only two windows are those little two slits on the sides up there to admit just about enough light in the place. The darker it is, the more mysterious it is, which reflects, of course, the mystery of behind the gods and behind the divine beings and so on inside. The room would have had wooden doors fitted. These doors were only open completely during the annual celebrations. The rest of the time they were closed, with only little doorways, or what we call flap doors, to be opened by the priests to go in and out of the temples when they needed. Neutral height, 24 degrees, 3 minutes and 45 seconds. But the interesting thing, it's so many degrees from Paris. It's quoted according to us. Because of course at that time, there is no way the French were going to put anything in British standards. That's the height of the animal. It was dedicated to the god Hapi, which is the Nile god. And in spite of the importance of the Nile and the floods to the ancient Egyptians, as far as I know, there are only two scenes in the whole of Egypt that tell us what the Egyptians believed caused the annual flood. And one of them is right here in this little chapel. It's a very small scene, so you might need to move closer to see it. It's just this part right there, which shows the Nile god sitting inside a cave, protected by a cobra and a vulture at the top. And in his hands he has two jars which he fills up from the eternal well to pour into the river. Every time he pours those 2 jars in the river, that causes the flood. So they believed. Either they were extremely big jars, or it was a very little flood. The interesting point is, why 2 hands? Did they actually realize that there were, or why the 2 flasks? Did they realize that there are 2 sources of the river? Or is it simply because he's only got 2 hands? We don't know. As far as historical records tell us, the Egyptians traveled on the river only as far as the 4th cataract. They traveled on land, however, all the way down to Somaliland and even further beyond, further south into Africa. But all on the Red Sea or on land. But on the Nile, as far as we know from all the records we have, only up to the 4th cataract. Underneath that is another scene where we have a figure of the pharaoh standing up there, probably following either a queen or a goddess. And you can see where the artist started working on this figure. The back, her crown, and he never came back to finish it. That line up there is believed by Egyptologists to be the very last line carved by an Egyptian workman in the temples of Egypt. That's where ancient Egyptian civilization ended. Move out for you to come closer. Names of the officers, but only numbers of the soldiers, the count of the soldiers who were involved in this operation, who died in action, died of disease in 1884-85. This was the British forces that were going down towards Khartoum, towards the Sudan, to save Gordon when he was besieged by the Mahdi revolution in the Khartoum. But the leader of this army was a British general, Sir General Garnet Wolseley. He was such an immaculate person that he took so much in preparation of the army, making sure all the handkerchiefs were ironed, the socks were matching, all the brass buttons were shiny and sprinkly. By the time he got to Khartoum, or even halfway down to Khartoum, Gordon was already dead. So he just turned around and came back up. 10 years later, Lord Kitchener, where he stayed for 8 years at the service of Ellard de Montenars and Edgesalt Esquire, and then he gives up on French at the end and changes back to English, and he was born at Acton near London. Right down there. That's many of the travelers up and down. It was the period at that time, there was a big time where the new frontiers were the discoveries of the sources of the Nile, and lots of people were traveling up and down the river to see the sources of the Nile and so on. Apparently those were...
They'd be filled with lead to hold them together. Were they with... They didn't do that in...
No, they didn't do that.
Egypt times. So that would have been... These... Yeah, like the mortise and tenon. These parts here...
What do you call it?
Well... Well, there is something called a mortise and tenon.
With the guys, I'm telling you, got away with the guys. It's so good.
Oh.
Look out! Yes.
She's okay, right?
Good heart. Good heart.
Oh, what is that?
You know what that means, don't you? He got my bum hip or something, did he? Oh my. Oh, this is great.
You got his chick. You know when we went?
Best. B-A-S.
I'm younger.
B-A-S?